Hey folks, Paul, Proteus, the streak's alive, keeping it going. I think something I'm interested in doing going forward is open sourcing a lot of the stuff that I've written over the years or that our team has written over the years. Because obviously, I think it's good to share arguments in debate. I think it's good because, at a minimum, it might help someone else use it, even if they're a lazy debater, right? It helps us because people come up with responses and stuff. And I definitely would love to hear some responses from folks in the comments if they have thoughts about what we're going to talk about today. But bottom line, today I wanted to share an argument that I have been working on over the last, I don't even know how many years. It's been through many forms, and I've done it with Sasan for at least 8 or 9 years now. Read it in policy, read it in Parley. I've had my kids read it in Parley and LD and all these other kinds of things. But that is going to be a critique or a criticism of spreading in debate, and I'm just going to be walking through kind of what our shell says and, you know, explaining why those things are in there and my justifications for those things. I will say that for me, I'm very much a truth over tech person. I think it's kind of silly to think otherwise, but I get it, whatever, it's a game, and if that's how you think, that's how you think. But for me, accessibility has always been an incredibly important part of debate, and I do think it is pretty much objectively true that spreading hurts accessibility in debate. I don't think there's any reasonable argument for why it would increase accessibility in debate, and I think that it's fine to have spreading and around with two people or four people, whatever, that know how to spread and can hang with it. But I do think, despite this, spreading frequently gets used as a tactic to abuse the other team, and you might think like, "Hey, get good" or whatever. But I think stop being so ableist. With that said, let's go through our spreading critique. First thing I want to talk to you about is, of course, the framework. For those of you who are unfamiliar with critiques, most frequently they have four parts to them. That is the framework, links, impacts, and alternative. And I also have front lines in this file that we'll discuss a little bit to the kind of common answers we've heard over the years. Starting with the framework, R starts as ROB. For those of you who don't know what that means, it stands for roll of the ballot. This is kind of where you tell the judge how the round should be evaluated. And our roll of the ballot is that the judge should vote for the team with the best methodology for promoting accessibility in debate. Obviously, when we get down to the alternative level, we'll talk about why we think our particular method is good for that. But we try and justify that here in three ways. First, we say that accessibility is a prior question, and it especially should be prioritized in educational spaces, because otherwise we justify the exclusion of individuals on the basis of their cognitive or physical abilities. The idea that like you suck at debate if you can't flow or speak 300 words per minute is clearly a question of ability, and I think that's problematic. And I think it's not even just a question of ability, but like it's kind of like a cultural elitism thing where when I was reading this in policy, I was reading it because my partner was a English was their third language and they struggled with it. And even when we would tell people ahead of time, "Hey, we're not going to spread at all. Please go slow," most of the time they wouldn't do that. And so yeah, bottom line, we think accessibility has to come first, right? What's the point of having a fair and educational debate if one team is being abused in that discussion and can't effectively participate? Secondly, we just have kind of something you're gonna have in most cases, which is essentially that like we're saying this comes before other impacts in the debate, and our justification here basically is that obviously the things that happen in the round are real and not in the fantasy land of debate, and we actually have control over those things. Whereas fiat, like none of this stuff's really gonna happen, even if it did. Not like we had control over that. And the sort of predictability question flows in favor of accessibility because you know whether someone was denied accessibility, but like we can't know if the impacts would actually happen. And then finally, the broader framing claim here that I think is relevant is prefer truth over tech. Again, if you've never heard this term, there's a lot of discussion and debate about tech over truth or truth over tech. Tech over truth basically says that it doesn't matter if you're lying or making stuff up as long as you're winning on the flow, and that judges will sort of ignore those things. And the justification for that is like it's the least interventionist way to judge debates, right? We don't want judges putting their opinions in, I guess. And I think there's an argument to be made for why that's like fair. I think truth over tech makes more sense to me because otherwise kids just lose debates because other people are faster than them, and even if they're right, they can lose. One silly thing that comes up in this sense for me that I always like to use as an example is like I could just be a objectively topical affirmative, and if I'm a novice and I'm debating an open debater and they read T, I just lose the debate not because I wasn't topical, but because they were more tricky and technical than me. I think that's silly. Uh, Obviously, our justification here, as you can see, if you've been looking at this, is that truth is logically prior. If it is true that spreading hurts accessibility in debate, then that implicates our ability to win the flow elsewhere, right? So, how could we evaluate through tech over truth? Of course, we're going to be behind on the tech if we can't flow what they're saying. That hinders accessibility. Accessibility logically prior. Okay, so that's the framework discussion. That's why we think this matters, why you should evaluate it as a judge, forget about their case, etc. Let's go down the links. We have a few. Now, this first one is a question of strategy, right? So, one of the big things, and sorry, I guess just to mention it here, when you're writing a file, you always want to be writing a file that is preemptive of things you expect people to say. And one of the most common answers to get spreading case is always like it's arbitrary or there's no clear bright line, and that's bad, right? Like, how do we know if we're going 350 per minute or 300 per minute, and why is one better than the other? We try and get around that with our framing here. So we say spreading refers to the rapid delivery of arguments in a debate and inarguably undermines accessibility in debate by introducing a barrier to physically writing down arguments or cognitively processing them. They spread in this round, and we asked them to slow down, but the rate remained inaccessible. We base this around accessibility, right? Now, you might say, well, how do we know teams would abuse this and just say it was inaccessible? Honestly, my opinion is that, like, cool, if teams do that, then they're assholes, but it's obviously much more important to protect people who actually are facing these barriers than it is to be worried about the people who cheat a million different ways, cheating in a million and one different ways. The BISA point here is where we really get to that preempt, where we say it's irrelevant whether there is a bright line for where spreading ends and starts, much like the Roth test for obscenity. You know it when you see it, and if you think they were spreading, that is proof enough. And then the CISA point is, because obviously we're mainly a Parley team, that's uniquely true in Parley because unlike policy or LD, we don't get a case doc, but instead are expected to transcribe in real time. Now, I do think spreading, in my personal opinion, is much less of an issue in formats like policy or LD because people have to give you like effectively a transcript of what they said, and that means that it gives you multiple opportunities for processing, kind of lets you do it at your own time, use prep more effectively, etc. And partly none of that's the case. You have to write down every single word essentially that someone's saying, or at least be able to comprehend it. And so that's kind of why this particular argument is in there. I want to talk about this ASA point a little bit more because this comes from something Sasan wrote in like our original Speed K probably 7 years ago. And basically, Sasan was talking about the metaphor of chess, right? What spreading does is it adds a physical component to what is ostensibly an intellectual activity. So what you've essentially done is say, we're playing chess, and it's exactly the same game as chess, but now each piece weighs like 50 pounds. And now it doesn't matter how smart you are, if you can't move that piece, you're going to lose anyway. You could know all the theory, all the strategy and stuff, but you're at a significant disadvantage just because of that. That's kind of what I think spreading does. But the second idea is this notion of assumption of a body, which is more tied to critical literature. And essentially, we have this like dichotomy here, and this is probably the most objectionable part of RK. I think people would probably argue that we're wrong about this dichotomy. I think it's a pretty legitimate dichotomy, but again, different folks, different strokes. So we say that there are only two logical justifications when preparing a strategy that requires spreading. The little I is that first is that all debaters are capable of understanding or flowing spreading, which relies on the notion of the perfectly abled body and re-entrenches ableism because it assumes bodies that can't are lesser or not worthy of consideration. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with this idea of like the assumption of a body or the mythic perfectly abled body, it's kind of the idea that when we're thinking about people, and we're describing debate cases, when we're talking about the world in general, and we think of people, we tend to not think of persons with disabilities or the disabled, depending on what you want to be called. And instead, we just think about like quote unquote perfectly able-bodied people, right? And that ignores that like just about everyone will be at least temporarily disabled at some point in their life, and that there are obviously shades of ability. Something Steve always talks about, and again, to be clear, this is coming from sort of the social constructionist perspective of ability and disability rather than from the like medical model. Steve used to always say that if we had to all climb a 20-foot rope to get to work instead of driving cars, there'd be a lot more people who are perceived as disabled, right? And that's kind of the idea here, right? That we've decided that like, well, normal people who do debate or quote unquote good people who do debate can spread. So of course we should do that. And we ignore those who can't when we're writing our strategies. The double I here, the second subpoint, is that the second option is you literally know the other team can't handle spreading and you chose to do so to gain a strategic advantage and undermine their accessibility. So basically the double bind here, and again, this is potentially objectionable, is either A, you just assume everyone can handle spreading, which is part of the problem, Or B, you know we can't handle spreading, and yet you still chose to do this to gain a tactical advantage, which obviously is bad, denies accessibility, education, fairness. Brings us to the impacts. I do this because sometimes people like to read the speed theory instead of the speed K. I prefer speed K because I think you get to play it a little looser with the links. Like there's less. Um, Basically, if you have to have an interp for spreading, it can cause issues. But if it's a link, you can always kind of spin that link. Impacts. First one's fairness. Obviously, spreading undermines fairness because it provides a barrier to accessibility, which hinders our ability to respond. Education. Education is undermined by spreading because we don't understand the things you said and we're unable to clash, which is where the education comes from. This is another place where people will kind of respond to things because essentially what they'll say is, no, spreading is good for education because it increases depth or breadth of education because we get to make more arguments or spend more time developing those arguments. Our argument is, yeah, but clearly you already know that stuff because you're the one reading those arguments. If we don't learn about those arguments or understand those arguments or get to test those arguments or clash with those arguments, then education is not increased, it's decreased. Also, it means that any research we did becomes mooted and irrelevant, which again, of course, means education's overall reduced. Again, people might disagree with that. 3 is pain. Spreading physically hurts members of our community. Multiple current and former competitors have developed carpal tunnel, tendonitis, and other repetitive stress injuries from this activity that will cause them chronic pain for the rest of their lives as a result of flowing high-speed rounds. NPDA, National Parliamentary Debate Association, College Parley's leadership, passed a bylaw this year to allow people to flow on their laptops and prep on their laptops even if they don't have an ADA waiver, ADA being the Americans with Disabilities Act. When I was a competitor, I had to get one of these and flow on a laptop. You had to get approval back then. And I had to do it because I just literally couldn't write with my hands anymore. And debate gave me horrific carpal tunnel that hurts me like every single day of my life. Like I can't even use like cast iron pans anymore. I like to cook a lot. I struggle with lifting weights or all of these other things in my life because of the chronic wrist injuries I have from having to flow on paper and flow really fast. Because again, obviously people are talking really fast, and if you want to be competitive, that's what you got to do. And I'm not trying to make this about me because I know several other people who have the exact same issue because of this. And we talk a lot about wellness in debate, and we talk about like long tournament days, but we're not really as concerned with, permanent life-altering injuries people get from the activity. That's kind of the impact here. 4 is the collapse of Parley. We're basically just saying parliamentary debate year on year is losing participation. A lot of people would disagree that it's because of spreading, and obviously it's not monocausal. Certainly it's not just spreading. It's not just the K. It's not just theory proliferation. It also has things like budgets or whatever it might be, just movement towards other debate events. But I think it's pretty much objectively true that, let me put it this way. I'm a community college professor, and obviously I'm recruiting kids to the team. And it's really a shame that I can't show kids like the national championship final round or show them the best debaters of all time and have them understand anything that's being said. And quite frequently, you have to like hide it from them because you're worried they'll be scared off and they will quit the activity because they feel like they can't do that. It's inaccessible to them, so on and so forth. I think that's objectively true. Let me put it this way. There's no argument for why spreading increases participation. I think it's far more likely that it does the opposite. And then lastly, just ableism in general, allowing teams to exclude their opponents or their judges on the basis of cognitive or physical ability, is ableist, and don't endorse ableism. So what's our alternative? Our alternative is vote AF/neg. Sometimes you read it on the AF, sometimes you read it as a neg, to reject spreading as a means of denying accessibility in every instance. So we're saying anytime someone's trying to deny accessibility, you should vote them down. Part of the reason that's written that way is because people will try and do like perms where they're like, oh, vote in every other instance or something, but obviously that wouldn't make any sense in the context of this. 3 arguments here. We say voting AF/neg is key. I think this is a really important argument. Being sympathetic post-round to teams that get spread out is not enough. I'm so tired of hearing judges tell people like, oh yeah, I'm really sorry this happened, but like get good, right? The only thing the judge can actually do is codify which strategies should win and should not win. And if you are choosing to codify teams being spread out or denying accessibility, then that's not good, obviously. And it doesn't matter that you feel bad after the round because it doesn't actually change anything. Solves the AF/neg. This is kind of a strategic thing that's not super relevant, but basically what we're saying is like there's no meaningful discussion of their affirmative in a world where we can, or negative in a world where we can respond to it, understand it, test it, or when debate collapses so it doesn't get read at all. And then finally is the disad of unintelligibility, where we basically say that any permutation renders the disad unintelligible, means there's a lack of political recognition, or rather, renders the disabled unintelligible, means there's a lack of recognition for those people. Again, it is, and this is an argument we're taking from Mike Selk, who used to read this in like 2013, 2014 in Parley. He was like my debate hero back then, SIU competitor. And he had this argument where he talked about like, it's the logic of retrofitting within the ADA, right? So the Americans with Disability Act basically says you don't have to build a building that has a wheelchair ramp from the start. You just have to do it once someone complains and like files a formal complaint about it for you to be in code. And so that's basically what we're saying the permutation does, right? The permutation says like, oh yeah, we know we spread, but like we'll just fix it now. And it's like, well, obviously the damage has been done. So that's the gist of the shell. Let's talk about the front lines, the things that I expect people to say, blah, 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 and our answers to them. The first thing that people have moved towards saying is that it's good for the neurodivergent / those with ADD and ADHD. I think this is kind of silly. There's obviously a difference between finding slow rounds boring and finding them accessible. There is not a disability student services office in the country who, if an instructor asked them how they should accommodate their students, would say you should just lecture really fast without a PowerPoint, right? I think this is a very disingenuous argument made by a lot of people that I find particularly like objectionable, right? There's just no argument to be made that this is increasing the accessibility for those folks. They might think it's more fun, but that's different than actually being accessible. Again, if you can find me a disability expert in the world who says this is good, I'd be willing to change my mind a little bit here, but I think you're going to really struggle with that because I've never heard any accommodation in that sense at all. I've never had a single student who faced any kind of disability that required or asked me or anyone else to like go faster. Seems weird. Seems silly that people make this argument. Whatever, there's a response. And again, that could be my limited experience. I don't want to speak for everyone in the world, but just how I feel. Second argument is that debate is a game. Obviously, debate's a game, but it's not just a game. It's something me and Sasan say all the time. Basically, our argument is that this exists above the game board, right? So, yeah, we're playing Monopoly or playing Dungeons and Dragons, and there's the rule set within that. But if someone did something that was like ableist or racist or xenophobic or whatever, it'd be pretty bad of the dungeon master to not factor that into how the campaign will play out for them. Some things happen on the board, and the other team might be trying to operate in that space, but you can't ignore that the people playing the game themselves are making these choices and doing these things that might be hindering or hurting the people on the other team. Another argument I think is stupid. Fairness is arbitrary / non-unique. This obviously isn't a reason that they should get to be fair to us. This is where people say like, well, there's all these other reasons debate's unfair. There's differences in funding or coaching or resource access, etc., etc., etc. This is kind of like saying to a woman of color, well, like, we're already unfair to you based on your gender, so it's totally cool that we're also going to be unfair to you for being a black person or Latinx person, etc., etc. That's a dumb argument. Like, there are obviously linear increases in fairness, and it's not good to be more unfair just because other things are fair. Permutation, obviously, this only depends on which side of the debate you're on. We just say there are no competitive parts, and they should have to specify them. When people try and read perms against this, generally they read some like nonsense perm that's either intrinsic or like severance, and they usually don't include the text, so we just ask them to specify which parts were not competitive. Already addressed this sort of spreading good for depth and breadth of education. Reading more arguments and being able to develop arguments don't matter if we can't engage with them or understand them. They already understand them because they wrote about them in prep. And then the last one's judge intervention, which again, a lot of people have a problem with. My position is that the judge's job is to intervene. The only purpose of having a judge and changing judges round to round is because the judge's personal interpretation of arguments impacts the round. You should probably intervene when people are denied access to the space, both in round and out of it. So that is our K-shell for anyone who's interested in it in terms of spreading. And I guess at the end here, I just want to say that I think there's a lot of people who don't like spreading or who feel it's unfair or who feel disadvantaged about it and who are afraid to read spreading critiques or speed theory because they're worried people will think they are bad at debate or they can't hang or whatever. And people may think those things, but at the end of the day, if people are attempting to deny you accessibility in the space, I think it's, you know, a really good idea to try and reclaim that through argument. And I will tell you that I have had a number of students read this position or a similar position over the years in front of a variety of judges and win debates, even against very good teams, because it's the other teams didn't have great answers, right? Um, because it's kind of hard to justify spreading when you really think about it when the other team asks you to slow down or be accessible. With that said, I definitely don't want people to abuse this, right? Like if a team's actually being accessible, if they're actually slowing down for you, I think it's kind of morally reprehensible for you to just use this as like a, a get out of jail free card or like a we're just ha 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 we tricked them kind of situation. I think this is the kind of position that should only be read when you really need that accessibility, because otherwise you kind of undermine the work that is being done to promote accessibility in that sense. Anyway, folks, that's another one of these videos. Streak stays alive. Catch you later.